Hello, crime fiction lovers, and welcome back to Noir by Night. Tonight, I'm bringing you something special, a dark psychological thriller called The Hollow Ground. This is a story that will take you deep into the mind of both hunter and hunted, where nothing is quite what it seems. Before we dive into this chilling tale, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where you're listening from tonight. Are you tucked up in bed, walking through a quiet neighborhood, or maybe driving home after a long day? And once you've heard the whole story, drop a comment about your favorite twist or moment that gave you chills. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more original crime fiction and mystery stories. Your support means everything to independent creators like me now. Let's turn off the lights and step into the shadows of Millbrook County, where Detective Sarah Chen is about to discover that some cases never truly end. Detective Sarah Chen had seen enough crime scenes to know that the worst ones always happened on beautiful days. The morning sun filtered through ancient oak trees, casting dappled shadows across the disturbed earth where someone had tried very hard to hide something that refused to stay buried. She crouched beside the shallow grave, her breath misting in the cool September air. The call had come in at dawn from a jogger whose dog had wandered off the trail. What the golden retriever found wasn't a stick or a dead rabbit. It was a human hand, pale as birch bark, reaching up through the soil like some grotesque flower. "What do we know?" Sarah asked her partner, Detective Marcus Webb, who was interviewing the visibly shaken jogger nearby. "Janet Morrison has been running this trail for 3 years. Says her dog Max has never behaved like this before." Marcus flipped through his notepad. The hand was already partially exposed when she found it. "Looks like last night's rain washed away some of the dirt." Sarah studied the scene. Pine Ridge Trail wound through the state forest just outside Millbrook, a place where teenagers came to drink beer and couples carved initials into tree bark. Not somewhere you'd typically dump a body unless you knew it well. The coroner's van pulled up, gravel crunching under tires. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes emerged, a woman in her 60s whose silver hair was always pulled back in a practical bun. She'd been examining the dead in Millbrook County for longer than Sarah had been alive. "Morning, Sarah. What's our situation?" "Shallow grave, maybe 18 inches deep. Single hand visible so far." Sarah gestured toward the disturbed earth. "Could be recent, could be older. Hard to tell until we excavate," Dr. Hayes nodded, pulling on latex gloves. "The soil composition here is interesting. A lot of pine needles, very acidic. That can slow decomposition significantly." As the medical examiner began her preliminary examination, Sarah's phone buzzed. Sheriff Tom Bradley's name appeared on the screen. "Chen. Sarah, I need you to be very careful with this one. We're getting calls from the state police. They think this might be connected to some cold cases they've been working." "What kind of cold cases?" "Missing persons. 3 of them over the past 5 years, all from neighboring counties. Young women, all last seen hiking or camping." Bradley's voice carried a weight that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "They're sending someone down this afternoon." Sarah looked back at the grave, where Dr. Hayes was carefully brushing soil away from what appeared to be a forearm. The skin was mummified, preserved by the acidic soil and cool temperatures. "Sheriff, how young are we talking?" 18 to 25. All of them vanished without a trace. The phone went quiet except for the sound of distant traffic on Highway 9. Sarah watched a hawk circle overhead, riding the thermals above the tree line. "I'll be careful," she said finally, after ending the call. Sarah returned to Dr. Hayes, who had exposed most of an arm and shoulder. The body lay on its side, curled in a fetal position. Female, I'd estimate early 20s based on bone development, Dr. Hayes said without looking up. She's been here a while, at least a year, possibly longer. Any obvious cause of death? Early to tell. We'll need to fully excavate before I can make any determinations. Dr. Hayes paused in her work, looking directly at Sarah. But I can tell you one thing right now. This wasn't random. What do you mean? Look at the positioning. She wasn't just dumped here. Someone took time to arrange the body, almost gently. Arms crossed over the chest, legs drawn up. This was done by someone who cared about her, or at least wanted to show respect. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September morning. In her 8 years working homicide, she'd learned to trust Dr. Hayes' instincts. The woman could read stories in bones that others missed entirely. How long until we can move her? Give me 2 hours to do this properly. I don't want to disturb any evidence that might be here. As Sarah walked back toward her car to call in the crime scene team, she noticed something that hadn't been visible. From the gravesite, about 50 yards deeper into the woods, partially hidden by undergrowth, stood an old hunting cabin. Its windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged dangerously, but it was clearly still used by someone. Fresh tire tracks led up to it from an old logging road. She made a mental note to check it out once they finished with the grave. In cases like this, the killer often stayed close to their victims. Sometimes they even returned to visit them. By noon, the crime scene team had cordoned off a 100-yard radius around the grave. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze like cheerful bunting at a macabre festival. Sarah had sent Marcus back to town to start running missing persons reports while she supervised the excavation. Dr. Hayes worked with the careful precision of an archaeologist, photographing and measuring every detail before moving on to the next section. The body was emerging inch by inch, telling its story through what it wore and what had been buried with it. Sarah, come look at this. The victim wore a faded denim jacket over what had once been a white t-shirt. More importantly, she wore jewelry that had survived the elements. A silver chain with a small cross pendant. Earrings that looked handmade with tiny blue stones. Any identification? Not yet, but look here. Dr. Hayes pointed to the victim's left wrist. A leather bracelet, well worn but intact, with letters burned into it. Can you make that out? Sarah squinted at the faded lettering. Looks like a Moy. Amy, that would be my guess. Sarah photographed the bracelet from multiple angles, then stepped back to survey the scene. Something was bothering her about the location, something beyond the obvious horror of finding a body. The spot felt chosen, purposeful. Dr. Hayes, is there any significance to burying someone this close to the surface? I mean, if you wanted to hide a body, wouldn't you dig deeper? The medical examiner paused in her work. That's an excellent question. Either the killer was interrupted, or they didn't care if the body was found eventually, or they wanted it to be found. Exactly. Sarah's radio crackled. Marcus's voice cut through the static. Sarah, I think I found something. Amy Morrison, 22, reported missing from Riverside County 14 months ago. Last seen leaving a camping trip with friends. Morrison. Sarah looked back toward the road where they'd interviewed Janet Morrison, the jogger. Same last name as our witness. Working on that connection now. But Sarah, there's something else. The investigating detective from Riverside wants to talk to you immediately. He says Amy Morrison's case has some unusual elements. Sarah looked at the hunting cabin through the trees. Yellow crime scene tape now surrounded it too, but she hadn't had a chance to examine it yet. I'll call him in an hour. I want to check out that cabin first. Be careful in there. One called the county records office. That property's been abandoned for 3 years, but the power's still connected. Someone's been paying the electric bill. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Active utilities meant someone had been using the cabin recently. She called for backup and waited 20 minutes for Officer James Park to arrive before approaching the structure. The cabin was larger than it had appeared. From the road, 2 stories, built sometime in the 1980s, judging by the construction style. The boards covering the windows were weathered but secure, nailed in place with newer screws that still showed traces of rust. The front door's locked, Officer Park reported, but there's a window around back that's not boarded up. They circled the cabin, noting details that might be important later. Fresh propane tanks connected to what looked like a heating system. A generator under a tarp that showed signs of recent use. Tire tracks in the mud that were too clear to be very old. The unboarded window was at ground level, probably leading to a basement. Sarah peered through the glass, using her flashlight to cut through the gloom inside. Jesus Christ, what is it? Sarah stepped back from the window, her face pale. Call it in. We need the whole team out here, and we need them now. Through the glass, she'd seen a basement room that had been converted into something resembling a workshop. Tables lined the walls, covered with tools and equipment she couldn't identify from her vantage point. But what made her stomach turn were the photographs tacked to the walls. Dozens of them, showing young women in outdoor settings, hiking, camping, walking alone on trails, and in the center of it all, a map of the Tri-County area with red pins, marking specific locations. Sarah counted 12 pins, scattered across 3 counties. She'd found 12 pins, but they'd only found 1 body. The state police arrived within an hour, led by Detective Ray Morrison, a man whose last name immediately caught Sarah's attention. He was tall and gaunt, with the kind of deep-set eyes that suggested he'd seen too much and slept too little. Detective Chen, Ray Morrison, State Police. I understand you found Amy. Sarah studied his face, looking for family resemblance to their witness. Morrison's a common name, but I have to ask. Janet's my sister-in-law, my brother's widow. Ray's voice was steady, professional, but Sarah caught the slight tremor when he mentioned Amy. Amy was his daughter, my niece. The coincidence was staggering. Janet Morrison's dog had found Janet Morrison's stepdaughter's grave. Either it was the most tragic luck imaginable, or something else was at play. Detective Morrison, I need to ask you to step back from this investigation. The conflict of interest. I know the protocols, Detective Chen, but I've been working Amy's case for 14 months. I know details about her disappearance that could be crucial here. Ray gestured toward the cabin. And I suspect what you found in there connects to cases I've been tracking across 3 states. Sarah weighed her options. She could insist on proper procedures and waste valuable time. Or she could work with someone who clearly had extensive knowledge of the case. Given the scope of what they'd discovered, she chose pragmatism. Show me what you know. Ray led her to his unmarked car and pulled out 3 thick case files. Amy Morrison, missing 14 months. Stephanie Walsh, missing 3 years. Maria Santos, missing 18 months. He spread crime scene photos across the hood of his car. All 3 were experienced hikers. All 3 vanished from trail systems in this general area. Sarah studied the photos, 3 young women, all in their early 20s, all with dark hair and athletic builds. The similarities were unmistakable. You think they're all connected to our cabin. I think your cabin is where he kept them before he killed them. The blunt statement hung in the air between them. Sarah looked back at the structure where crime scene technicians were preparing to enter through the basement window. Detective Morrison, I need to know if you can handle this objectively. If Amy's in there, if we find evidence of what happened to her, I can handle it. His jaw tightened. Someone's been hunting these women like animals. Amy was smart, strong, careful. She didn't just get lost or have an accident. Someone took her, and I'm going to find out who. Sarah's radio crackled. Officer Park's voice came through, tense with excitement. Detective Chen, you need to get down here immediately. We're inside the cabin, and it's worse than we thought. They descended through the window into a basement that felt like stepping into someone's twisted mind. The photographs on the walls weren't just random shots of young women. They were surveillance photos, taken with a telephoto lens from concealed positions. Each woman appeared multiple times, photographed over what looked like weeks or months. The map showed more than just red pins. There were detailed notes written in small, precise handwriting. Dates, times, behavioral observations. Subject leaves, apartment 7:30 a.m., weekdays. Runs Pine Ridge Trail, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Lives alone, no boyfriend visible. But the most disturbing discovery was a journal, handwritten in the same precise script. The technician handling it wore thick gloves as he read selected passages aloud. Entry dated 15 months ago. Amy Morrison shows potential. Excellent physical conditioning, solitary hiking habits. Parents divorced, limited social connections. Low risk of immediate search. Ray Morrison's face had gone completely white. Sarah put a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. There's more, the technician continued. Initial contact was successful. Subject trusts easily when approached by someone appearing to need assistance. Note, maintain injured hiker persona for future operations. Sarah felt sick. The killer had studied these women like a scientist studying lab rats, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities, their lives, before making his move. How many entries are there? Over 50 pages, covering approximately 3 years. But detective, there's something else you need to see. The technician led them to a wall that had been hidden behind a curtain. Mounted there were 12 driver's licenses, displayed like trophies. Amy Morrison's face stared back at them from the 3rd position. Sarah counted them again. 12 licenses, 12 red pins on the map. But they'd only found one body. We need cadaver dogs, she said quietly. We need them today. The search expanded at dawn the next day. 6 cadaver dogs and their handlers spread out across Pine Ridge State Forest, following GPS coordinates that corresponded to the remaining red pins. On the killer's map, Sarah watched from the command post as teams disappeared into the woods, knowing that each discovery would represent someone's daughter, sister. Friend. Dr. Hayes had worked through the night to complete Amy Morrison's preliminary examination. Her findings were disturbing in their precision. The cause of death was strangulation, she reported to the assembled investigators. But there are other injuries consistent with captivity. Rope burns on wrists and ankles, suggesting she was restrained for an extended period. Malnutrition indicators suggest she was held for weeks, possibly months. Detective Morrison sat stone-faced through the briefing. Sarah wondered how he was processing the clinical details of his niece's final weeks. "Any evidence of sexual assault?" asked Captain Torres from the state police. Surprisingly, no. Whatever this killer's motivations, they don't appear to be sexual. Dr. Hayes consulted her notes. The positioning of the body, the care taken in burial, the lack of sexual violence, it suggests a different kind of psychological pathology. Sarah had been thinking about this all night. What if it's not about killing them? What if the killing is just the end result of something else? "Explain that theory," Torres said. "Look at the journal entries." He studied them for months, learned their routines, their habits, their lives. Then he approached them with a cover story designed to gain their trust. Sarah stood, pacing as she thought out loud. What if the point was the control? The knowledge that he could take them any time he wanted. A power fantasy, Dr. Hayes agreed. The ultimate expression of dominance over another person. The radio interrupted their discussion. One of the dog teams was reporting a hit near the old quarry, about 2 miles south of Amy's gravesite. Sarah and Detective Morrison drove out together, winding through forest roads that grew progressively narrower. The quarry had been abandoned for decades, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Massive stone walls rose on 3 sides, with standing water at the bottom that reflected the sky like black glass. The cadaver dog, a German shepherd named Rex, had alerted at the base of the eastern wall. His handler, Officer Lisa Park, was already marking the spot with flags. "How deep?" Sarah asked. "Rex is trained to detect remains up to 15 feet down, but his behavior suggests this one's much shallower, maybe 3 or 4 feet. As the excavation team arrived and began their careful work, Sarah studied the location. Like Amy's grave, this spot felt purposeful. The killer had specific reasons for choosing each burial site. "Detective Morrison, did Amy ever mention this place, the quarry?" "She came here sometimes to photograph birds. There's a heron rookery on the far side." Ray's voice was hollow. "She posted pictures on her Instagram account." Sarah felt pieces clicking together in her mind. The killer knew that too. He knew she came here, knew it was significant to her. "You think he buried them in places that meant something to them?" Before Sarah could answer, one of the excavation team called out, "We've got clothing." This victim wore hiking boots that looked expensive and well maintained, a fleece jacket in forest green. As more of the body was revealed, they found another driver's license in a waterproof wallet. Maria Santos, 23, from Riverside County. Maria had been missing for 18 months. According to her file, she was a nursing student who loved rock climbing and nature photography. Like Amy, she'd disappeared while on a solo hiking trip. Same cause of death. Sarah asked Dr. Hayes, who was conducting her preliminary examination. "I'll need to do a full autopsy, but yes, it appears so. Ligature marks on the neck, evidence of prolonged captivity." Dr. Hayes paused in her work. "Sarah, there's something else. Look at this." In Maria's jacket pocket, wrapped in plastic, was a handwritten note, the same precise script they'd seen in the journal. "For M, you were beautiful when you climbed. I wanted to preserve that beauty forever. You understand now that some things are too perfect for this world." Sarah felt a chill reading the words. This wasn't just murder, it was something far more. Twisted, a killer who believed he was doing his victims a favor by ending their lives at what he saw as their peak. The radio crackled again. Another dog team had found something. By the end of the 3rd day, they'd recovered 6 bodies from Locations scattered across Pine Ridge State Forest. Each burial site had been chosen with the same careful consideration. Each victim had been killed in the same manner, and each grave contained a note expressing the killer's twisted reasoning for taking their lives. Sarah sat in the makeshift command center, surrounded by evidence boards and case files, trying to build a psychological profile of someone who could orchestrate such systematic horror. "The notes are the key," she told the assembled task force. "He's not killing them out of rage or sexual compulsion. In his mind, he's preserving them." "Preserving them from what?" asked Captain Torres. "From getting older, from becoming ordinary, from losing whatever qualities he found beautiful in them." Sarah stood before the board where 12 photographs now hung, the victims whose licenses they'd found in the cabin. 6 had been recovered, 6 remained missing. Look at the ages. All between 19 and 25. All athletic, outdoorsy types, all at what society might consider their physical peak. Detective Morrison, who had remained mostly silent during the briefings, finally spoke up. "So we're looking for someone who sees aging as corruption, who thinks he's saving these women from some fate worse than death." "Exactly, and someone with extensive knowledge of this area. The burial sites aren't random. They're places where each victim spent time, places that meant something to them." Dr. Hayes entered the command center carrying a thick folder. "I've completed autopsies on all 6 victims. I can confirm that none showed signs of sexual assault, and all died from ligature strangulation using the same type of rope, 3-strand nylon climbing rope, probably new when purchased." "Climbing rope," Sarah repeated. "So our killer has knowledge of outdoor equipment. More than that, the knots used were complex, not something an amateur would know. I'd say our killer has extensive experience with rope work, possibly rock climbing or mountaineering." Sarah felt the profile sharpening in her mind. "So we're looking for someone local, probably male, with extensive outdoor experience and climbing knowledge, someone who's been operating in this area for at least 3 years. And someone who's still out there," Morrison added grimly. 6 more victims are unaccounted for." As if summoned by his words, Officer Park rushed into the command. "Center Detective Chen, we just got a call from the ranger station. A hiker found something on the old fire road about 5 miles north of the quarry." Sarah grabbed her jacket. "What kind of something?" "A fresh grave." The scene was different from the others. This burial site was recent. The disturbed earth was still soft, and the grave was even shallower than Amy's had been. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was the realization that this victim was still wearing clothes she recognized from missing person reports filed just 2 weeks ago. Lisa Chen, no relation to Sarah despite the shared last name, was a 24-year-old graduate student from the university who'd disappeared while researching local bird migration patterns. Her car had been found abandoned at a trailhead just outside town. "He's escalating," Sarah said quietly to Morrison as they watched Dr. Hayes begin her examination. "The cooling-off period between victims is getting shorter. Or he's feeling pressure from our investigation. Maybe he's trying to clean up loose ends." Sarah studied the surrounding area. Unlike the other burial sites, this one felt hurried, imprecise. The killer's usual careful attention to meaningful locations seemed absent. "Dr. Hayes, what's your preliminary assessment?" "Same cause of death, same rope burns indicating captivity. But she's only been dead for a few days, maybe a week at most." The medical examiner's face was grim. "Sarah, there's something else. She's got defensive wounds on her hands. This victim fought back. Sarah felt a spark of hope. Any chance she left DNA evidence on her attacker? I'll know more after the autopsy, but yes, there's a good chance. She scraped skin from under her fingernails. For the first time since the investigation began, they had physical evidence that might lead directly to the killer. Sarah's phone was already ringing with the lab's number when she noticed Detective Morrison walking toward the tree line, his posture rigid with tension. "Ray, what is it?" He was staring at something carved into the bark of a large oak tree about 20 feet from the grave. Sarah approached carefully, not wanting to disturb any evidence. Cut deep into the bark, in the same precise handwriting they'd seen in the notes, were the words, "Detective Morrison, some hunts take patience. Your turn to be hunted." The killer knew who was investigating him. More than that, he was taunting them, drawing them into his twisted game. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent voices as the realization spread through the team. They weren't just hunting a serial killer anymore. They were being hunted back. Sarah insisted that Detective Morrison be placed under protective surveillance immediately. But Ray refused to leave the investigation. The message carved into the tree was clearly meant for him personally, which suggested the killer knew far more about their investigation than anyone was comfortable with. "He's been watching us," Sarah said during the emergency task force meeting. "The question is how long, and how much does he know about our operations?" Captain Torres pulled out a map of the area around the latest crime scene. "We're going to assume he has detailed knowledge of our movements and plan accordingly. All communications go through encrypted channels only. No more radio chatter about specific locations or timing." Sheriff Bradley raised the obvious concern. "If he knows this much about us, he might know where we live, where our families are." The room went quiet. Sarah thought about her apartment 15 minutes away, her elderly mother who lived alone across town, her sister's family in the suburbs. How long had this person been watching them without their knowledge? "We also need to consider that he might have inside information," Torres continued. "Someone with access to our investigation could be feeding him details." The implication hung heavy in the room. Sarah looked around at faces she'd worked with for years, people she trusted with her life. The idea that one of them might be compromised was almost too disturbing to consider. Dr. Hayes entered the meeting with news that shifted their focus back to evidence. "I've completed the autopsy on Lisa Chen. She definitely fought her attacker. There's skin and blood under her fingernails that doesn't match her DNA type. We should have results from the lab within 48 hours. Any other physical evidence?" "Something interesting. She had a small puncture wound in her neck, consistent with injection from a syringe. I'm running toxicology to see what substance was used, but I suspect it was some kind of sedative." Sarah felt pieces clicking together. So he's changed his approach. Instead of gaining their trust with a cover story, he's resorting to chemical restraint. That suggests he's feeling pressured, making mistakes, or adapting to new circumstances, Morrison said darkly. Maybe the earlier victims went willingly because they trusted him. But Lisa Chen knew to be careful because of all the publicity around the missing hikers. The meeting was interrupted by Officer Park bursting through the door. "Detective Chen, we just got a 911 call. Someone found another message carved into a tree at the Pine Ridge trailhead. The same handwriting." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What does it say?" "Detective Chen, you're getting closer, but I'm getting bored. The game changes now." The Pine Ridge trailhead was crowded with concerned hikers and media representatives when Sarah arrived. The message had been carved into a prominent oak, tree right next to the main trail map, ensuring maximum visibility. But it was what she found in the parking lot that made her blood run cold. Her personal vehicle, a blue Honda Civic she'd driven to work that morning, had all 4 tires slashed. Under the windshield wiper was a note written on the same paper they'd found with the other victims. Detective Chen, I know where you live. I know you take your mother grocery shopping every Saturday. I know your sister's children walk to school along Maple Street. Stop looking for me, or I'll stop being particular about my victim selection. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the words. This had moved beyond a professional investigation into something deeply personal. The killer wasn't just threatening her, he was threatening her entire family. Captain Torres appeared at her shoulder, reading the note. We're moving your family into protective custody tonight. No arguments. He's escalating rapidly, Sarah said, her mind racing through implications. First, the message for Morrison, now direct threats against my family. Whatever triggered this change, we're running out of time before he does something irreversible. Detective Morrison walked over from examining Sarah's vandalized car. Sarah, I think I know what triggered this. Look at the timing. We found Lisa Chen's body yesterday morning. He carved the message for me yesterday afternoon. Your car was vandalized sometime between this morning and now. So what happened yesterday that made him change tactics? We found fresh DNA evidence. For the first time in 3 years, he made a mistake that could lead us directly to him. Morrison's face was grim with realization. He knows we're close, and he's panicking. Sarah looked around at the crowd of reporters, hikers, and law enforcement personnel. Somewhere among all these people, someone was watching their reaction, feeding information back to a killer who stayed one step ahead of their investigation. We need to set a trap, she said quietly, and we need to do it before he decides our families are acceptable targets. The plan was dangerous and against every protocol Sarah had been taught, but they were running out of options. If the killer was monitoring their investigation and felt cornered by the DNA evidence, he might make an even bigger mistake if they gave him an irresistible target. Sarah would be that target. Absolutely not, Captain Torres said when she presented the idea. We're not using a detective as bait for a serial killer who's already demonstrated he can track our movements. He's not going after random targets anymore. He's going after people connected to the investigation. Sarah spread out a map of the area on the conference table. If I go hiking alone on one of the trails where he's taken victims before, he might see it as an opportunity to eliminate the lead investigator. Detective Morrison shook his head. Sarah, this guy has been planning kills for months, studying his victims' routines. You can't just walk into the woods and expect him to take the bait. Actually, we can make it more convincing than that. Sarah had been thinking about this all night. He's been watching us, which means he knows I'm under stress. My car was vandalized. My family's in protective custody. It would be completely believable that I might go for a solo hike to clear my head. Dr. Hayes, who had been quiet during the debate, finally spoke up. There's something you should know about Lisa Chun's autopsy that might affect this decision. The sedative I found in her system, it's not something you can buy over the counter. It's a veterinary anesthetic called Telazol, used primarily for large animals, which means our killer has access to veterinary supplies, Sarah said. Or he works in a profession that uses them. Large animal veterinarian, zoo employee, wildlife researcher. Dr. Hayes consulted her notes. The important thing is that Telazol works very quickly when injected, but it's not always fatal. Lisa Chen might have survived if she'd received medical attention. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. So he's not necessarily trying to kill immediately anymore. He's trying to incapacitate and transport, which makes your plan even more dangerous, Morrison said. If he gets you with that drug, you'll be unconscious within minutes. Captain Torres was already shaking his head, but Sarah pressed on. That's why we use it to our advantage. I wear a GPS tracker and a hidden camera. The moment he approaches me, we know exactly where he is. And if something goes wrong, if the GPS fails or the backup team can't reach you in time. Sarah thought about the message threatening her family, about 12 driver's licenses mounted like hunting trophies, about young women who'd trusted someone enough to let him get close. If we don't stop him now, he's going to kill again. And next time, it might be someone I care about. The debate continued for another hour, but eventually, Torres agreed to a modified version of Sarah's plan. She would hike a well-known trail during daylight hours, wearing multiple tracking devices and followed by undercover officers at a discreet distance. If the killer made contact, they'd be ready. The trail they chose was Cascade Falls, a popular 5-mile loop that connected to several of the locations where bodies had been found. It was isolated enough that the killer might feel comfortable making an approach, but accessible enough that backup could reach her quickly if needed. Sarah prepared carefully for what might be her last hike. GPS tracker sewn into her jacket lining, panic button disguised as a fitness tracker, tiny camera mounted in her cap, pepper spray in an easily accessible pocket. Most importantly, she carried a syringe filled with naloxone, a drug that might counteract the effects of telazol if she could inject herself quickly enough. At 8 a.m. on a crisp October morning, Sarah set out alone on Cascade Falls Trail, knowing that somewhere in the woods around her, a killer was watching. The first 3 miles of the hike passed without incident. Sarah maintained a steady pace, stopping occasionally to check her phone or take photographs, trying to behave like any other solo hiker enjoying the fall foliage. Through her earpiece, she could hear the whispered updates from her backup team as they shadowed her progress from parallel trails. It was at the halfway point, where the trail crossed a small creek on a wooden bridge, that she first felt eyes on her. The sensation was subtle at first, just an awareness that she wasn't alone in the woods. But as she paused to drink from her water bottle, she caught a glimpse of movement in the trees about 50 yards upstream. Contact possible, she whispered into her microphone. Someone moving parallel to my position, north side of the creek. Copy. That, we're adjusting positions, came the response from Detective Morrison, who was leading one of the backup teams. Sarah continued across the bridge and up the trail toward the falls, but she could sense someone tracking her movement through the forest. The killer was skilled. She only caught occasional glimpses of him moving between trees, never enough to get a clear look at his face or build. At Cascade Falls, the trail opened into a scenic overlook where water tumbled down a 40-foot rock face into a deep pool. Sarah sat on a bench, pretending to rest while actually scanning the tree line for any sign of her pursuer. That's when he spoke. Beautiful morning for a hike, Detective Chen. The voice came from directly behind her. Sarah's blood froze as she realized how close he'd gotten without her noticing. She turned slowly, hand moving toward her pepper spray. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the lean build of someone who spent significant time outdoors. Dark hair, unremarkable features, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd. What struck her most were his eyes, completely calm, as if approaching an armed detective in the middle of a murder investigation was the most natural thing in the world. "You know who I am," Sarah said, not making it a question. "Of course I do. I've been watching you work my cases for weeks now. You're quite thorough." He smiled, and Sarah felt her skin crawl, though not quite thorough enough to avoid walking into an obvious trap. Sarah's hand found the panic button on her wrist, but before she could activate it, she felt a sharp pain in her neck. The man had moved with startling speed, injecting something into her carotid artery with a syringe that seemed to appear from nowhere. Talazol works fastest when injected directly into major blood vessels, he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "You have maybe 30 seconds before you lose consciousness, detective. I'd suggest you don't fight it." Sarah's vision began to blur, but her mind remained sharp enough to remember the naloxone syringe in her jacket pocket. With tremendous effort, she reached for it, knowing her backup team would be moving in response to her GPS signal. "Clever girl," the man said, watching her fumble with the antidote, but not quite clever enough. The world went dark, just as Sarah heard the distant sound of voices shouting her name. Sarah woke to the sound of water dripping and the smell of damp earth. Her head felt like it had been stuffed with cotton, and her limbs responded sluggishly to her mental commands. As her vision cleared, she realized she was in some kind of underground chamber, lit by battery-powered lanterns that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. She was seated in a wooden chair, her hands bound with climbing rope in knots so complex they looked more like art than restraints. The space around her was larger than she'd expected, easily 20 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that she couldn't make out the top in the dim light. "You're awake sooner than usual," came a voice from the shadows. The naloxone helped, though not as much as you'd hoped. The killer stepped into the light, and Sarah got her first clear look at him. He wore hiking clothes that looked expensive and well-maintained. His movements were precise, economical, like someone accustomed to working in tight spaces. "Where am I?" "About 40 feet beneath Cascade Falls. This is a natural cave system that connects to the old mine shafts." He gestured around the chamber. With obvious pride, "I've been developing this space for 3 years now. Quite comfortable, don't you think?" Sarah tested the restraints, finding them impossibly tight. The rope burns on her wrists were already beginning to form. "My team knows exactly where I was when you took me. They'll find this place. I'm counting on it, actually." He pulled up a second chair and sat facing her, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with the earthy odor of the cave. "You see, detective, I've reached a decision about how this story ends, and your colleagues are going to play a crucial role. What do you want? To finish what I started, of course. But first, I think you deserve to understand what you've been investigating." He stood and walked to a wooden table where Sarah could see maps, photographs, and notebooks arranged with military precision. "Do you know what I do for a living, detective?" Sarah studied his face, looking for clues she might have missed in their brief encounter above ground. The calloused hands, the precise way he moved, the knowledge of complex knots and cave systems. Wildlife researcher, she guessed, or maybe search and rescue. Close. "I'm a wildlife photographer, specializing in large predators. I've spent the last 15 years documenting hunting behavior in wolves, mountain lions, bears." His voice carried genuine enthusiasm, as if discussing a fascinating hobby. "Do you know what I learned during all those years of observation?" Sarah didn't answer, but he continued anyway. Predators don't kill randomly. Every hunt serves a purpose. Population control, natural selection, maintaining the health of the ecosystem. He turned back to face her, and Sarah saw something almost religious in his expression. Human society has lost that natural balance. Detective, we keep our weak alive, our damaged breeding, our inferior specimens consuming resources. So you decided to restore that balance. I decided to preserve perfection before it could be corrupted. He pulled out a photo album and began turning pages. Look at Amy Morrison at 22. Beautiful, strong, intelligent. Now imagine her at 50, overweight, bitter, disappointed by life's compromises. Sarah stared at photographs of Amy hiking, climbing, laughing with friends. Pictures that had obviously been taken without her knowledge, sometimes from considerable distances. You stalked her for months. I studied her. I learned everything about her life, her routines, her relationships. And when I determined that she represented peak human female development, I preserved that perfection forever. Sarah felt sick listening to his calm justification for murder. You're insane. I'm practical. Do you know how many young women waste their peak years on pointless relationships, dead-end jobs, destructive habits? I gave 12 exceptional specimens the gift of eternal youth. You murdered 12 people. I preserved 12 works of art. His voice remained maddeningly calm. But now, detective, I find myself in a situation that requires adaptation. He walked back to the table and picked up what looked like a radio. Your investigation has forced me to accelerate my timeline considerably. The DNA evidence you recovered from Lisa Chen will eventually lead to my identification. I have no illusions about that. Sarah's heart began racing as she understood what he was suggesting. You're going to disappear. Not exactly. He turned the radio to what sounded like a police frequency, and Sarah could hear voices coordinating search patterns around Cascade Falls. I'm going to complete my collection, then end the experiment entirely. What does that mean? It means, Detective Chen, that you're going to help me lure your colleagues into this cave system, and then I'm going to demonstrate what happens when imperfect specimens try to interfere with natural selection. Sarah tested her restraints again, feeling panic rising in her chest. Through the radio chatter, she could hear Detective Moore voice coordinating search teams, getting closer to finding the cave entrance. They'll be armed. You can't take on an entire police task force. The killer smiled and walked to another corner of the chamber, where Sarah could now see what looked like mining equipment. This cave system is part of the old copper mine. Do you know what miners used to clear stubborn or deposits, detective? Sarah's blood went cold as she realized what he was suggesting. Explosives, and I've spent 3 years learning exactly how to use them. The radio chatter grew more urgent as Sarah listened to her colleagues closing in on the cave entrance. Through the static, she could make out Morrison's voice directing teams to search the area around the base of the waterfall, exactly where the killer wanted them to go. How long have you been planning this? Sarah asked, trying to keep him talking, while she worked frantically at the rope around her wrists. Since the moment I realized you'd found Lisa Chen's DNA under her fingernails. He was busy with something at the equipment table, his back turned to her. I knew it was only a matter of time before the lab results led you to me. So why not just disappear? Leave the state, start over somewhere else, because that would be admitting defeat. He turned back to face her, holding what looked like a detonator connected to several wires. Besides, detective, you've become personally involved in my work. The threat to your family The vandalism of your car, that was never part of the original plan. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. You lost control. I adapted to changing circumstances. But now, those adaptations have forced me to conclude the experiment entirely. He began connecting wires to charges that had been placed throughout the chamber. When your colleagues enter this cave system, they'll trigger a collapse that will bury all the evidence permanently. Through the radio, Sarah could hear Officer Park reporting that they'd found disturbed earth near a concealed entrance about 30 feet from the base of the falls. Her team was minutes away from walking into a death trap. You'll die too, Sarah pointed out, still working at the ropes. This isn't preservation, it's suicide. It's completion. My work was always meant to be temporary, a demonstration of what's possible when someone has the courage to make difficult decisions. His voice carried a strange serenity. The real purpose was to prove that society's reaction would be predictably hysterical. Sarah felt one of the knots beginning to loosen. The killer had been precise, but not paranoid. He'd assumed that Lazol would keep her unconscious much longer than it had. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice, much clearer now. We've found the entrance. It's a natural cave system, extends back at least 50 feet. Sarah's GPS signal is coming from inside. Don't go in there, Sarah shouted, knowing they couldn't hear her, but hoping the killer might react. Instead, he simply turned up the volume on the radio and continued his preparations. Detective Morrison will enter first. He's too emotionally invested to wait for backup. The others will follow, and then I'll bring down enough rock to seal this chamber permanently. Sarah finally felt the rope give way around her left wrist. She kept her hands positioned as if still bound while working on the restraints around her ankles. The killer moved to a position where he could see the main entrance to the chamber while still controlling the detonator. They'll find us eventually. The GPS signal will lead them directly here. But by then, everything will be prepared. Through the entrance tunnel, Sarah could see the faint glow of flashlights getting closer. She had maybe 2 minutes before. Her colleagues walked into the chamber and the killer triggered his explosives. Why Amy Morrison specifically, she asked, hoping to distract him while she freed her feet. Why start with her? Amy represented the perfect subject. Athletic, intelligent, beautiful, but most importantly, isolated. Her parents' divorce had left her without strong family connections. Her hiking habits made surveillance easy. He paused, listening to footsteps echoing through the tunnel. And her stepfather was never really invested in finding her. Sarah felt the last rope fall away from her ankles. She was free, but the killer still held the detonator, and her colleagues were about to enter his kill zone. Detective Morrison's voice echoed from the tunnel entrance. Sarah, can you hear me? She can hear you, Detective Morrison, the killer called back. But I wouldn't recommend entering this chamber if you want to see her leave it alive. Sarah tensed, knowing she had one chance to stop this. The killer was focused on the tunnel entrance, his finger poised over the detonator trigger. If she could reach him before he realized she was free, she might be able to prevent the explosion. Detective Chen is unharmed, the killer continued, but that situation is temporary. I suggest you listen carefully to my terms. Sarah took a deep breath and launched herself from the chair. Sarah's tackle caught the killer completely off guard, sending both of them crashing into the equipment table. The detonator flew from his hands, skittering across the stone floor as they struggled for control. The man was strong, but Sarah had the advantage of surprise and desperation. The detonator, she shouted, toward the tunnel entrance as she grappled with the killer. Don't let him reach it. Detective Morrison appeared in the chamber entrance, weapon drawn, just as the killer broke free from Sarah's grip and dove for the fallen device. Morrison's shot echoed through the chamber, striking the killer in the shoulder and spinning him away from the detonator. "Stay down," Morrison commanded, but the wounded man continued crawling toward his prize. Sarah reached the detonator first, clutching it against her chest as backup officers flooded into the chamber. The killer slumped against the stone wall, blood seeping through his shirt, his face twisted with rage and disappointment. "You don't understand what you've done," he gasped. "Those women were perfect. They were art. They were people," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "They had families, friends, futures you stole from them." Dr. Hayes arrived with the paramedics, immediately beginning treatment on the killers. Gunshot wound while crime scene technicians documented the underground chamber. The space was even more disturbing than Sarah had initially realized. Walls lined with surveillance photos, detailed maps of victim locations, and journals documenting 3 years of stalking and murder. As the killer was loaded onto a stretcher, he made one final attempt to justify his actions. "You'll see," he told Sarah. "When you're 40, 50, 60, you'll understand what I was preserving." Sarah watched them carry him away, knowing she'd never understand his twisted logic. Some minds were simply too damaged to comprehend the value of life beyond their own narrow definitions of perfection. Over the following weeks, the killer was identified as Marcus Webb, not Sarah's partner, but a 34-year-old wildlife photographer who had used his profession as cover for extensive surveillance operations. His real name was David Coleman, and he had been using false identities to purchase equipment and rent properties throughout the region. The DNA evidence from Lisa Chen's fingernails provided definitive proof of his guilt, while the journals found in both the cabin and cave contained detailed confessions to all 12 murders. 6 more bodies were recovered based on locations marked in his maps, bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers. Detective Ray Morrison struggled with the personal nature of the case, but eventually returned to active duty. He kept a photo of Amy on his desk, not one of the surveillance shots taken by her killer, but a family picture showing her laughing at a barbecue, surrounded by people who loved her. Sarah underwent mandatory counseling after the ordeal, working through the psychological impact of being held captive by a serial killer. She found herself hiking the trails around Millbrook more often, reclaiming spaces that had been contaminated by violence and returning them to their original purpose, places of beauty and peace. David Coleman was sentenced to 12 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He showed no remorse during his trial, maintaining to the end that his victims should have been grateful for the preservation he provided. The judge called his crimes an affront to human dignity and recommended he be held in solitary confinement to prevent him from influencing other inmates. On a crisp morning, exactly 1 year after Amy Morrison's body was found, Sarah returned to Pine Ridge Trail for a memorial service organized by the victims' families. 12 oak trees were planted along the trail, each bearing a small plaque with a victim's name and dates of birth and death. As Sarah stood among the families, listening to stories about daughters, sisters, and friends who had been taken to, soon she realized that David Coleman had been wrong about everything. These women hadn't reached their peak at 22 or 24. They had been just beginning their lives, with decades of experiences, relationships, and achievements. Ahead of them, the real tragedy wasn't aging or imperfection or any of the killer's twisted philosophical justifications. The real tragedy was all the life that had been stolen, all the love never given, the dreams never pursued, the difference never made in the world. But as Sarah watched family members embrace each other and share memories of the women they'd lost, she also saw something else. Love that transcended death, connections that couldn't be severed by violence, the enduring power of human relationships to create meaning even in the face of senseless loss. The memorial service ended with the release of 12 white doves, each carrying a small banner with a victim's name into the clear autumn sky. Sarah watched them disappear over the tree line, carrying their messages toward whatever waited, beyond the reach of killers and caves and all the darkness that some people brought into the world. As she walked back to her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Dinner Sunday. Your sister's bringing the kids." Sarah smiled, thinking about ordinary Sunday dinners and her nephew's terrible knock-knock jokes and her niece's endless questions about police work. All the beautiful, imperfect, constantly changing moments that made up real life. She texted back, wouldn't miss it. Some things Sarah had learned were indeed too perfect for this world. But they weren't what David Coleman had imagined. They were the quiet moments between people who cared about each other. They were the connections that made life worth preserving, not in some twisted fantasy of eternal youth, but in the daily choice to love and protect and cherish what time we're given. The killer had been wrong about everything, but especially this. The most beautiful thing about life wasn't its perfection, it was its continuation. Detective Sarah Chen stood at the window of her new office, watching morning joggers make their way along Pine Ridge Trail. The path had been renamed Memorial Trail 3 years ago, and the 12 oak trees planted for the victims had grown tall enough now to provide real shade for hikers seeking rest. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Morrison, who had transferred to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit after the Coleman case. "Saw the news about your promotion, Captain Chen. Well deserved. Coffee when I'm in town next week." Sarah smiled, typing back her agreement. Ray had never fully recovered from the personal nature of Amy's case, but he'd channeled his pain into becoming one of the country's leading experts on serial killer psychology. His insights had helped solve 17 similar cases across 4 states. The door to her office opened, and Detective James Park entered with a case file. At 32, he'd matured into one of the department's most reliable investigators, though he still approached difficult cases with the same methodical precision that had served him well during the Coleman investigation. "Captain, we've got a situation that might interest you. Body found this morning near Cascade Falls, but this one's different." Sarah felt a familiar chill. Different how? Natural death, for one thing. Elderly hiker, looks like he had a heart attack on the trail. But when we searched his backpack, we found this. Park placed an evidence bag on her desk containing a small notebook filled with what looked like surveillance photos and handwritten notes. Sarah's blood went cold as she recognized the precise handwriting. "That's impossible. Coleman's been in solitary confinement for 5 years. I thought the same thing. Called the prison this morning to confirm. David Coleman died in his cell 3 weeks ago. Apparent suicide." Park opened the notebook carefully. "But Captain, look at the dates on these entries. They're all from the last 6 months." Sarah studied the pages, feeling a familiar dread settle in her stomach. Photos of young women hiking, jogging, camping, detailed notes about their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. The same methodology that had terrorized the county 5 years earlier. Do we have identification on any of the subjects? We're working on it. But Captain, there's something else. The elderly hiker who died, his name was Robert Coleman, David Coleman's father. Sarah sank into her chair, processing the implications. He was continuing his son's work. That's what we think. The notebook contains references to completing the legacy and honoring the vision. Park flipped through more pages. There are also detailed maps of the cave system where you were held, with notes about preserving the shrine. Sarah thought about the underground chamber where she'd nearly died. After Coleman's conviction, the caves had been sealed with concrete to prevent curiosity seekers from accessing what had become known locally as the murder caves. Have there been any missing persons reports in the last 6 months? Young women, hikers, campers, 3 possibles, all from neighboring counties, all within the victim profile Coleman preferred. Park consulted his notes. Jennifer Walsh, 20, disappeared during a solo camping trip 2 months ago. Maria Rodriguez, 25, vanished while photographing wildflowers 6 weeks ago. And Lisa Park, no relation to me, went missing just 10 days ago while trail running. Sarah felt the old familiar weight of a complex investigation settling on her shoulders. 3 more young women, possibly taken by someone who'd inherited David Coleman's twisted philosophy along with his genes. What do we know about Robert Coleman? 74 years old, retired wildlife biologist, lived alone about 20 miles north of here, in a cabin that's been in the family for decades. Park pulled out crime scene photos. The interesting thing is what we found at his residence. The photos showed a room that looked disturbingly similar to David Coleman's basement workshop. Maps, surveillance photos, detailed notes about potential victims. But this collection was more extensive, more sophisticated. He's been at this longer than his son was, Sarah realized. That's our working theory. We think David Coleman learned his methods from his father, not the other way around. Park pointed to dates on some of the older surveillance photos. Some of these go back 15 years, Captain. Long before the first official victim. Sarah studied the evidence, feeling pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. David Coleman hadn't been an isolated killer developing his own twisted philosophy. He'd been carrying on a family tradition of hunting human prey. Get me everything we can find on Robert Coleman's background. Employment records, property ownership, any connections to missing persons cases going back 20 years. Sarah stood, reaching for her jacket, and put together a search team. If he was continuing his son's work, there might be more victims. We haven't found yet. Where are we starting the search? Sarah looked out her window at Memorial Trail, where families now walked safely among the oak trees planted for David Coleman's victims. She thought about the 3 young women who might still be alive if they'd acted on this information sooner. The family cabin. If Robert Coleman was hiding victims somewhere, that's where he'd keep them. As they left the office, Sarah's phone rang. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, now in her 70s, but still serving as county medical examiner, had news about Robert Coleman's autopsy. Sarah, you need to know that Mr. Coleman didn't die of natural causes. Someone gave him a massive dose of insulin, enough to trigger fatal hypoglycemia. Sarah stopped walking. Someone murdered him. That's my assessment. And Sarah, there's something else. We found evidence that he'd been beaten before he died. Rope burns on his wrists, defensive wounds on his hands. Someone held him captive before they killed him. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. Someone who knew what he'd been doing. Someone who wanted information from him first. That would be my guess. The question is whether his killer was trying to stop his activities or take them over. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized they weren't just dealing with a copycat killer or family legacy. Someone else was involved. Someone who'd known about Robert Coleman's activities and had taken action to either stop them or continue them. The investigation that had ended 5 years ago was just beginning again. Sarah looked at Detective Park, who had heard enough of the phone conversation to understand the implications. James, I want surveillance on the families of all previous victims, starting immediately, and get me a list of everyone who had access to information about the original Coleman case. You think someone from the original investigation might be involved? Sarah thought about the precise timing of Robert Coleman's death, the sophisticated nature of his surveillance operation, the fact that someone had gotten close enough to capture and torture him for information. I think someone's been watching us as closely as the Colemans were watching their victims, and now they've decided to make their move. As they drove toward the Coleman family cabin, Sarah's radio crackled with urgent voices. Another body had been found, this one at the base of Cascade Falls, where David Coleman had first captured her 5 years earlier. But this wasn't one of Robert Coleman's victims. This was someone who'd been dead for less than 24 hours, killed with the same ligature strangulation method that had become David Coleman's signature, left in the exact spot where Sarah had been taken, as if someone wanted to send her a very personal message. Sarah pressed harder on the accelerator, racing toward a confrontation she'd hoped was finished 5 years ago. But some hunts, she was beginning to understand, never really ended. They just waited for the right moment to begin again. The Coleman family cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road, hidden among tall pines that blocked most of the morning sunlight. As Sarah and Detective Park approached the structure, she noticed details that immediately put her on alert. Fresh tire tracks in the mud, windows that had been recently cleaned, a propane tank connection that looked new. Someone's been maintaining this place, Park observed, hand resting on his service weapon. Sarah called for backup before they approached the front door, remembering how David Coleman had turned his underground chamber into a death trap. The family cabin might contain similar surprises. While they waited for additional units to arrive, Sarah studied the property through binoculars. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from the road, 2 stories with what looked like a basement level, plus several outbuildings that could serve as storage or workshops. Movement in the upper window, Park reported quietly. Sarah focused her binoculars on the 2nd floor and caught a glimpse of someone moving past a curtained window. Not the shuffling gait of an elderly man, but the quick, purposeful movement of someone much younger. Robert Coleman's been dead for 3 weeks, Sarah murmured. So who's living in his cabin? The backup units arrived silently, taking positions around the property while Sarah and Park approached the front door. The porch was swept clean, with potted plants that had been recently watered. Someone was definitely occupying the space. Sarah knocked firmly. Police, open the door. Footsteps approached from inside, but the door remained closed. After a long moment, a woman's voice called out, "Detective Chen, is that really you?" Sarah felt her blood freeze. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't immediately place it. Someone who knew her name, knew her rank, but wasn't immediately opening the door. "This is Captain Chen, Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Please open the door and identify yourself." The locks turned, and the door opened to reveal a woman Sarah recognized but hadn't seen in 5 years. Jennifer Morrison, Amy's younger sister, now in her mid-20s, with dark hair and athletic build that made her look remarkably similar to her murdered sister. Jennifer, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, Captain. Jennifer stepped back to allow them entry, but Sarah noticed she kept her hands visible and her posture relaxed. Though I suppose the answer is obvious. You found Robert Coleman's body. Sarah entered the cabin cautiously, noting how clean and organized everything appeared. This wasn't the home of an elderly recluse who'd died alone. Someone had been living here recently, maintaining the space with careful attention to detail. Jennifer, I need you to explain what's going on. How did you know we'd be coming here? Because I've been waiting for you to find him. Jennifer led them into a living room that had been converted into what looked like a research center. Maps covered the walls, connected by colored strings that traced relationships between locations, dates, and victims. I've been tracking Robert Coleman for 2 years. Park had his hand on his weapon now, though Jennifer didn't appear to be armed. Ma'am, are you saying you killed Robert Coleman? I'm saying I stopped him from killing 3 more women. Jennifer gestured toward a wall covered with surveillance photos that looked identical to those found in David Coleman's collections. Robert Coleman had been operating for over 20 years. His son learned everything from him. Sarah studied the evidence. Jennifer had assembled photos of missing women dating back decades, detailed timelines of disappearances, maps showing burial locations that had never been discovered. The scope was staggering. Jennifer, if you had evidence that Robert Coleman was an active serial killer, why didn't you bring it to the police? Because I wasn't sure which police I could trust. Jennifer pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Sarah. Look at the dates on these surveillance photos. Look at the detail level, the inside information about police procedures and search. Patterns. Sarah flipped through the photos, feeling a familiar chill as she recognized crime scenes from the original Coleman investigation. But these photos had been taken from positions that should have been restricted to law enforcement personnel only. Someone was feeding him information about our investigation, Sarah realized. Not just feeding him information, actively helping him avoid detection. Jennifer pointed to a photo that showed Sarah herself at Amy's gravesite, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been inside the police perimeter. Robert Coleman couldn't have gotten these shots without help from someone with official access. Park was studying the wall of evidence, his face pale with understanding. You're saying there's a cop involved in this? I'm saying there's been a cop involved from the beginning. Jennifer pulled out another set of photos, these showing various law enforcement personnel at different crime scenes over the past 5 years. Someone who's been protecting the Coleman family operation for decades. Sarah felt pieces of an enormous puzzle shifting into place. The Coleman family hadn't been operating alone. They'd had an inside source, someone who could warn them about investigations, provide information about potential victims, even help cover up evidence. Jennifer, where did you get all this material? From Robert Coleman himself, before he died. Jennifer's voice remained steady, but Sarah caught a slight tremor when she mentioned the old man's death. I spent 3 days getting him to tell me everything. About the family business, about his police contact, about where the bodies are buried. You tortured him. I got answers from him. Answers that will let us find the women who are still missing. Jennifer met Sarah's eyes directly. Answers that will identify the cop who's been helping them hunt people for 20 years. Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent transmission. Captain Chen, we need you at the falls immediately. We've found something at the crime scene that changes everything. As they left the Coleman cabin, Jennifer insisted on accompanying them. Sarah agreed, reasoning that the young woman clearly had information crucial to the investigation. But she also instructed Park to keep Jennifer under close surveillance. Cascade Falls. Dr. Hayes was waiting with news that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The victim we found this morning wasn't killed by Robert Coleman, she reported. Different rope, different knots, different methodology entirely. But the positioning of the body, the location choice, someone's deliberately mimicking David. Coleman's signature, any identification on the victim. Jennifer Walsh, 23, from Riverside County. She was one of the women Robert Coleman had under surveillance. Dr. Hayes consulted her notes. But Sarah, here's the interesting part. She was killed somewhere else and moved here. The blood pooling patterns don't match the position we found her in. Sarah looked around the crime scene, remembering her own capture at this exact spot 5 years earlier. Someone had brought Jennifer Walsh's body here, specifically to send a message to Sarah personally. Dr. Hayes, do we have time for death? Based on liver temperature and rigor mortis, she died between midnight and 3 a.m. last night. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Robert Coleman had been dead for 3 weeks, which meant someone else had killed Jennifer Walsh. Someone who wanted to continue the Coleman family tradition, but with their own twisted modifications. Jennifer Morrison approached from where she'd been studying the crime scene. Captain Chen, there's something you need to know about Jennifer Walsh. According to Robert Coleman's records, she wasn't supposed to be his next victim. What do you mean? I mean someone else took her before Robert could get to her. Someone who knew about his surveillance operation and used it for their own purposes. Jennifer pulled out a notebook from Robert Coleman's collection. Look at his final entries. He was frustrated because 3 of his selected targets had been compromised by someone else. Sarah read the entries, written in Robert Coleman's meticulous handwriting, references to interference and competition and someone else hunting my territory. The old man had been angry that another predator was operating in his area. So we have 2 different killers. We had 2 different killers. Now we have one killer who's eliminated his competition and inherited a 20-year database of potential victims. Sarah's phone rang. Sheriff Bradley's name appeared on the screen. Captain, I need you back at headquarters immediately. We just got a call from the state prison. Someone broke into David Coleman's old cell last week and took several boxes of his personal effects. Sarah felt the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. Someone had eliminated Robert Coleman, stolen David's research materials, and was now using both men's work to continue their twisted legacy. But this wasn't a family member or random copycat. This was someone who'd been part of the investigation from the beginning. Someone who'd watched them work the original case, learned their methods, gained their trust. Someone who was still watching them now. As Sarah looked around at the assembled law enforcement personnel, she realized that one of them wasn't there to help solve the case. They were there to make sure it never got solved at all. The end. Asterisk. Thank you for listening to The Hollow Ground. I hope this expanded version keeps you engaged through its twists and turns. From the original Coleman investigation through the revelation of a much larger conspiracy spanning decades, this story explores themes of inherited evil, corruption within law enforcement, and the way trauma can drive people to seek their own form of justice. The revelation that the Coleman family had inside help, and that someone is now continuing their work, sets up questions about who can be trusted when the system itself may be compromised. Don't forget to let me know in the comments where you listened from tonight and which revelation surprised you most. Was it the discovery of Robert Coleman's involvement, Jennifer Morrison's vigilante investigation, or the implication that a law enforcement officer has been complicit all along? If you enjoyed this expanded psychological thriller, please hit that like button and subscribe for more dark fiction that keeps you guessing until the very end. Your support helps me continue creating these complex, atmospheric stories. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones wearing badges.